guys, John Morris here, back with video number 2. And first off, I just want to say thank you for watching this video. Thank you for all the people who've written me messages, thanking me for the course, asking questions, generally interacting with me through email and whatever way you happen to do that. I just want to say thank you. It's been awesome to see the excitement over this course as I released the first video. And so again, I just want to say thank you. I know you have a lot of things going on. I know you're probably very busy, so I really appreciate you taking the time out to not only watch this video, but also get in touch with me and interact with me and so forth. So again, first off, I just want to say thank you. Second, I want to talk a little bit about what we're going to cover in this second video. In the second video, we're going to go into we're going to essentially take the theory that we talked about in video number 1, and we're going to put that into practice, and we're going to go into phpMyAdmin, into a MySQL database, and we're actually going to create all of the different tables that we talked about in video number 1, and I'm going to show you how to create your fields and how you want to set up your different fields, your field types, all the different attributes, how you want to name the different columns that you have in your tables and so forth. We're going to dive into all of that in this second video so that you know exactly how to set up your database correctly. So that's what we're going to cover in video number 2. Essentially, we're taking again the theory we learned in video number 1 and this is where the rubber meets the road. We're going to put that into practice here in video number 2. Now, before I dive into that, I have been getting a lot of questions via email and so forth about the broader MySQL course that's going to be released. Again, in that video, I'm going to essentially continue what we're learning here and go through the rest of the steps of the things that you would need to know in order to become essentially a master of MySQL and PHP and how the two work together. Now, I want to be clear on what that course specifically is. It's not a in-depth look at all of the different queries that you could do with MySQL. It's not a MySQL course in the sense of learning all the different things and all the different kinds of queries that you could do with MySQL. What it is it's the bridge, or it's the gap between MySQL and PHP. It's about the two interacting together. And so we're going to cover a lot of MySQL stuff. Obviously now we're covering that, but we're also going to cover a lot of PHP stuff, and we're going to cover a lot of coding. And ultimately the point is to get you to a place where you can write out your database class that you can use for any application that you build going forward. And you can learn how to turn that into an abstracted database class that you can use going forward from here on out. It can use prepared statements if you want, or it could not. It could use PDO, it could use MySQL. It can be created however you want it to be created. And you can have that piece done, locked away in a class, and you can move on with building your applications, because the reality is that you should spend very little time actually working on your database class and all of your time working with your database class. So I want to get you over that hump of working on your database class and get you to the point where it's done. You don't have to worry about it anymore, and you can start working with it. And then I'm going to show you at the end of that course why really you don't even need to write your own, although it's good to know all the code to do it, because there's others out there that do a lot of it for you, and you can write a much smaller set of code to abstract it into a full database class that you would need going forward for all your applications. So that's kind of the gist of the full course that's going to be released. Yes, it's going to be a paid course. I know a lot of people sometimes have heartburn with that in the coding community. It is what it is at the end of the day. I mean, we can agree to disagree on that one if you think that it should be a course that I release for free. I release a lot of stuff for free. I have a lot of YouTube videos. I have a lot of code snippets and things on my site. And so this is one of the ways that I help fund all of the free things that I do. And here's something really key for you to understand going forward with this, and why I charge for these courses, or some of these courses. And the reality is I'm a coder just like you. I work, I have a regular job that I work in terms of, I work for a company called Wishlist Products where I code on a daily basis. I also do freelance work where I have freelance clients that I work with on a daily basis. If you've hung around with me for any amount of time, you know I don't have a ton of time. In fact, my release schedule in terms of training for you is intermittent because I'm so busy with my actual coding work. And so one of the ways that I'm able to take away from or get away from that coding work, be able to focus solely on you, is by charging for my courses, because that income helps replace the income that I would normally get from a client or from my regular job. And I can set that stuff aside for a while and just help you directly. Okay, so that's one of the big reasons why I charge for my courses. It's not going to be very expensive. I think you'll be very surprised and happy at what the price is going to be. So that's one of the biggest questions that I've got. Is it going to be a paid course? Yes, it is. It will be very affordable, but that's the reasoning behind it. And if you disagree with that, then I'll just say we can agree to disagree. There's still plenty of free training available on my site, and you can take advantage of that. And really, frankly, you can take advantage of the free videos I'm releasing here, because I'm releasing quite a few. So what I want you to do now, if you haven't already, over to the right of this video, there's going to be a sign-up form. That sign-up form is to be on the early notification list, to be notified immediately when a new video comes out, when the course goes live, and so on and so forth. As we go forward, in the next video I'll explain a little bit more about this, but being on that list when it comes to being able to get access to this course is going to be very, very important. So if you haven't yet, go ahead and enter your name and email to the right to get subscribed to that early notification list, so that you can make sure if you want access to this course, you're going to be able to get it. Alright, so with that said, all that mumbo jumbo out of the way, let's get to the actual video. It's going to come up right after I get done here talking. We're going to talk about, get in and talk about how to create your tables and fields in your database manually, and essentially take video 1 and put it into practice so that you can understand exactly how you need to create your tables in phpMyAdmin. Alright, so thanks for watching. Let's dive into that video. I'll see you next time. Hey, John Morris here, and in this video we're going to talk about how to set up your database tables manually. Now, the reason I'm showing you this is because I know that, again, with my conversations with coders and people that that I've worked with and who've seen my videos and stuff, I know that there's certain people that are building their applications for one website. So you're not building an application that you're going to release to the world. You're really just building your application for you, and so in that case, a lot of times you're going to be managing your database manually using phpMyAdmin. So I want to cover that also, because even if you are going to release your plugin to other people and you need some sort of script to generate your tables dynamically, it still is very helpful to understand how it's done manually. Okay. So that's what I'm going to cover in this video, and that's kind of a lead into the next video, which is obviously how to create them dynamically. But before we dive into the actual how-to of to create tables, one thing I want to talk about is your field types. Now, this is somewhat related to what we're talking about in this video, but it's kind of the best place that I can put this, and it's something that I want to talk about because I know for me, when I was learning, when I was first learning how to code, and even, a little bit to this day, because I don't spend a lot of time, creating fancy MySQL tables. Usually the stuff I do is pretty basic in terms of database structure, which is good. That's the way you want to do it. But again, it's just something that I know when I was learning, it was kind of confusing, and it can make you look at MySQL or make you look at phpMyAdmin and kind of feel like I don't really know what's going on. So I just want to talk about it so you don't feel that way, and kind of give you just some of the big things that you want to look at when you're creating your fields. So as we go through and we look, I'm looking at the structure section of the WP post table. So this is going to give me information about each column, and that's what we want to do. And of course we have our names over here, and you'll see this when we get into actually creating these manually. You have to specify these things, which is kind of why I want to talk about it. You also have the type, you have the collation, you have attributes, whether it's null or not, the default, any extras, which auto increment is usually the one that you're going to be concerned with there. Okay, what I want to talk about is I want to talk about the field types. Now you'll notice here that there's kind of some overall basic types. So we have our int types. So we have big int. I think all these are big int. Yeah, so all these are big int. We have our text types. So we have long text, we have text down here. Sometimes you'll see medium text. Sometimes, although less rarely, you'll see tiny text. I don't see tiny text near as much. But you have your text types, you have your date time types. So you see we have date time here, we have date time here. And then you have your varchar types. So sometimes people can get fused about what type should I use where, okay? So overall, what you want to do is you want to use, integer types for things that are going to be specifically integers. You want to use, again, the text types for things that are going to be specifically text. You want to use date time types for things that are going to be date and time. That allows you, when you write your queries later, to be able to query the MySQL database in the way that's meant to be queried. Okay, it also provides you some built-in protection against someone who might try to attack your database. So for example, let's say that you have your post author set as a string or set as text or maybe varchar or whatever. And but what you're actually putting in there is integers. You're putting in the ID of the author, like we do here in WordPress. Well, if you have it set as a text type, then it's possible for someone to actually enter text into that field. Okay, so they may be able to compromise your database and actually enter text into that field. And it could be text that helps further compromise your database somehow. Now, if you set that field as an integer and someone tries to insert text into it, it won't allow it. It's not going to let it do that. It has to be in the right format. Okay, so formatting your fields properly is kind of a built-in security check that you can use. Now, again, it's very basic. It's not going to keep someone from not necessarily compromising your database, but it's important to do that. So because your database is ultimately where everything is going when it comes to your application. So you want to make sure that you do everything you possibly can to keep it from getting compromised. Also, when it comes to creating queries, using the right types allows MySQL to perform more quickly because it's being used in the way that it was meant to be used. Okay, so most people don't have a lot of confusion when it comes to the integer types. You understand that it's an integer that goes in an integer type. Maybe you'll see here this is big int and it has 20. So a lot of times that's what you're going to see. In fact, if you see all of these here, most of these are 20, 20, 20, 20. I guess we have an int 11 here. Now, I don't want you to get too wrapped up with the big int because, again, a lot of people think when they see that 20 that that's a limit. That's not actually a limit. It just essentially means that anything short of 20 is going to be left padded with zeros. So again, for numbers like IDs and authors where you're going to have, you may have a lot of records or whatever, then you can just use big int for that. So again, most people don't get super confused with the int ones or the date time ones because we understand that that's a date time. You just need to put it in MySQL format. Even the text ones kind of make sense. Now you'll notice here that for the title we're using for PostTitle, we're using text, and excerpt, we're using text, which essentially just has a shorter limit to the amount of characters that can be entered there compared to something like long text, which is what we use for the post content. So the difference between those is essentially comes down to storage capacity. And that makes sense for a title. You know, we're not expecting to have the same amount of content as or the same amount of characters as we would for the actual content of a post. Same with the excerpt, especially since with WordPress, it's actually limiting the excerpt. So the one that I think confused people the most, when I know I was kind of like, what is this varchar? So the difference between really the kind of information that can be stored in, say, text or varchar is the same. So it's not like int or date time, where if you don't format it correctly, it's not going to store it. You can store arbitrary text in both varchar and text, or long text or medium text or whatever. The difference between the two has to do with how it's stored. So varchar is essentially stored in line in the database, whereas text fields are stored are not stored in line. And what's stored is essentially a pointer to where that text is actually stored on the server. So what that means is that generally, if you're going to retrieve a text field, it's going to take a little bit longer. It's going to require a little bit more resources because it has to get that field, look for the pointer, and then go actually grab the content. So whereas varchar being stored in line, it can just grab it right there. The problem is that with MySQL, there's maximums to how many characters can be stored per row, and so on and so forth. So if you have a field that's going to have a lot of text, or could have a lot of text, then you generally want to use your text fields like text and long text and medium text. Whereas if you have you're going to have a field where the content is going to be predictably short. So for example, the post status, the statuses that WordPress has are published, or are publish. These are the actual values: published, draft, scheduled, I believe. So those are predictably short. We know that they're going to be short, so there's no problem storing them in line. Whereas with the content, we don't know what that's going to be. It could be very long. Same with the title. We know it's not going to be as long as content, but it still could be pretty long. Same with the excerpt. Okay, so that's essentially the difference between the two. You'll notice where in here where there's fields where it could be arbitrarily long text, where we don't really know if it's going to be long or not. There's text fields that are used, whereas things that are predictably short, varchar is being used. So the status, there's only a certain number of statuses that can go in here, and they're all short. The comment status, ping status, post password, we assume is probably going to be short. The post name is essentially a slug, which we again assume is going to be pretty short. The GUID again is essentially a URL, so again we can kind of assume that's going to be pretty short. The post type, so that could be post, could be page, it could be a custom post type name, but again that's going to be predictably short. So where you have a field that's going to contain content that is going to be short, that's again, for all intents and purposes, is going to be pretty short, you can go ahead and use varchar, and then that's going to help you with performance. Whereas if you're just not sure and you kind of assume that it might be longer or could be longer, then you would want to use text fields like we're using here. Okay, so when we get into actually setting up the fields, this is an important part because you actually have to make these decisions in terms of what field types am I going to use. Okay, so I just wanted to cover that a little bit. Again, I'm not going to go into great depth about that, because I think understanding the basic kind of the pieces about how to put that together is all you really need for most of what you're going to do. Now, if you get heavy into where you really need to have specific field types and you need to know all the ins and outs, then I would say, probably go in and dig in and learn and figure all that stuff out. But for most of what you're going to do, you can just follow those general guidelines that I covered. All right, so that said, let's go ahead and go in and actually create some tables and create some fields. All right, so what we're going to do is we're actually going to just kind of go back to the home, and I want to show you how to first create a database. So if we head over here to databases, then we can create a database. You can select the collation, so whatever it happens to be for your particular needs, you can select that here. I'm just going to hit create and leave it as it is. So that created our database that we're looking for, MySQL demo. So we'll come over here to that database, and now we can create tables. Okay, so I'm going to first, again, we talked about before in the first video in the how to structure your database. We talked about the different types of tables that you might have: an object table, a meta table, and a relationships table. So those are the three kinds of tables I want to show you how to create. So the first one I want to show you how to create is an object table. Okay, so I'm just going to call this table objects so it's easy for us to remember. And in this table, I'm just going to create 5 fields, and you'll see why I'm creating 5. For your application, again, you'll kind of want to map all this out, and you'll know exactly how many number of columns you need. So to create the table, I just entered that information and I hit go. And now it's going to give me the interface to be able to create the actual fields. So the first one that I'm going to create is an ID field. Essentially, every table you create is going to have an ID like this. This essentially becomes like your key for that table. So every record that's in this table is going to have an ID associated with it. That makes it just a lot easier to create relationships between tables, to be able to create a meta table that you can associate by ID, to be able to query for things. It just makes everything a lot easier. It's pretty much required. I mean, it's not required by MySQL, but for your application and your database structure, it's really something that you need to do. All right, so for this, we're just going to use big int. We'll do 20. The default, we'll leave it none. The collation, we won't worry about. The attributes, we're going to put it unsigned. Now you might wonder why we put this as unsigned. Essentially what this means is that when you make this field unsigned, it means it can never be negative. So for our ID that we're going to have auto increment, that's pretty important. We don't want this field to ever be a negative number. Okay, so if we didn't put this, it could possibly be a negative number. Again, we don't want to. That would basically essentially break our application. It wouldn't make sense for what we're doing, so we don't want to allow it. Okay, so we're going to put it as unsigned so we can never have a negative number. Leave the null unchecked because this can't have a null value. Here we're going to put the primary key because this is going to be the primary key for this database, and we're going to select this to make it auto increment. So it's going to automatically increment every time a record is added to this database, which is what we want. Right, the second field that we're going to create, I'm going to call PostTitle. We're going to just assume that we're going to model a CMS here. Okay, so for PostTitle, we're going to go with text. For the length and value, we're not going to set anything. For the default, we're not going to have a default. For the collation, I'm just going to let that be.
Attributes, let that be null. We're going to let that be, and the index, we're going to let that be, and auto increment. Okay, so that's essentially all we need to set there is the post title and the type. Okay, next we're going to do the post content, and under that we are going to do long text because this could potentially store a lot of text in it. Again, for this, we're not going to worry about any of the rest of the values on here. Those are really the only two that we're concerned with at this point. All right, for the next field, I'm going to go with post name. This is essentially our slug. And so for here, this is where we will want to use something, where's that? There it is, like varchar, and we'll put in our 20 here. And essentially, yeah, the rest of these can just stay the way they are. Okay, so this is something that we know is going to be predictably short. Now, here is where, depending on what this field is, you may have a default here. So for example, if you look at the post name table in the WordPress database, you'll notice that the default is a string publish. So the default, if nothing's passed to this field and a record is created, the default is to publish, which makes sense because in WordPress, it makes sense to have the default status of the post to be published. That's generally what most people do or want to do when they're publishing or when they're submitting a post as a record to the database, is they want it published. Again, depending on your application, that may or may not make sense, and it also depends on the field. Of course, for post name, that doesn't actually make sense because we don't have a default slug. We're going to generate the slug based off of the title. The last one that we're going to do is post date. And so this is the date of the post, and we're going to use then a date time type here. Right, so we're going to use a date time here. And essentially for this one, that's all we're really concerned with. Okay, so we don't really need to worry about the rest of these fields. Right, so we have our ID, our title, our content, our slug, and our date. Now again, for your application, you may have more fields, you may have less fields, but that gives you an idea of how to actually create the tables in your database and some of the reasoning behind why you might use different types of data and the different values that you would set and why, based off what kind of fields you have. Right, so what we'll do now is we'll go ahead and save that. And that has now created our table. So if we go into our table, you can see that here under the structures tab, because we don't have any records, you'll see that we have our table created here. Right, so that's exactly what we needed for our object table. The next type of table that we want to create is we're going to create a meta table. So we'll go ahead and come over here to create table. And we're going to go ahead and enter our values in the fields that it's provided here. So you'll notice at the top we have table name. So we're going to go, we'll just do object meta, okay? And then we're going to create the different fields. So the first one, again, is going to be ID. Now, one thing to keep in mind here, and again, I don't want to get too advanced, like too complicated here, but if you're working with constraints, so what a constraint allows you to do is it allows you to, for example, let's say that you create a meta table and you're associating meta to different posts. Well, let's say you delete a post. Well, if you delete a post just from the post table, that's not going to actually delete any of the metadata that's associated with it automatically, because you would actually have to go through and write your code to do that. Or you can use what's called a constraint, and essentially what that constraint will allow you to do is if it makes it so that a field can only exist in a table based off some sort of condition. So what a lot of people use them for is you can constrain the fields in a meta table based off of what's in the actual object table. So if a post gets deleted in the object table, then the meta table is essentially going to dump all of the records in the meta table that was associated with that object ID. All right. So I tell you all of that because when you write constraints, having two different tables that have the same column name can get a little bit confusing. So that's why if you look at, for example, the WordPress database, they use meta ID. Now, again, I don't actually know why they specifically do it. I haven't actually ever read if that's, or really looked into if that's exactly why they do it. But I know from my experience, that's one of the reasons why people do it, is so it's not so confusing. So you're not writing a constraint with a reference to a bunch of fields with the exact same name. They just happen to be in different tables. Okay, so we're going to do meta ID here just so for that reason, just to kind of show you best practice or whatever. All right, so for the meta ID, then we're going to want to use our big int 20. And again, for this, we want to have it unsigned. We want to have it auto increment. Okay. And then for the next field, this is essentially going to be our object ID. So this is going to reference the objects in our objects table by ID. So that's where we're going to put this. Looks like I missed. And again, for this, we're going to use big int. Use 20. We're going to make it unsigned, but we won't auto increment it, obviously, because we're going to populate it with the actual value. For the next field, we're going to do meta key. And for this one, because a meta key is generally going to be predictably short, because you're not going to want to have some big long meta key that you're trying to query for. So we're going to do our, it's at the top of our char, 255, because it could be a little bit, it could be a little bit longer. Null. In this particular case, you actually can allow null here. Probably won't be, but you can allow that here. And then for our meta value, we're going to go with long text. This can actually be null as well, because the value of this could be null. Okay, so and actually the defaults here will be null as well. Okay, so that's kind of how we can set up a meta table here. Again, we have the actual ID of this record in the database. We have the object ID, which is from our objects table that this metadata is attached to. We have the key for that metadata, and then we have the value. All right, so we'll go ahead and save that. And that creates our object meta table. All right, so the last table that we're then going to create, or the type of table that we're going to create, is a relationships table. All right, so we'll go ahead and hit create table. Now, usually when you do this, you reference the two objects that are going to come together. Okay, so, I work for Wishlist Products. We sell a product called Wishlist Member. So one of the relationships tables that we have is called content levels. So it essentially puts a relationship between content and levels. We also have user levels, which puts users into levels. Okay, and that's essentially how a protection system works. But in this particular case, we'll just do object tags. Okay, so we'll just say that this is a relationships table for objects and tags. All right. So the first the first record again here is going to be our ID. We'll do big int 20, just like we always do. And we'll make it unsigned, and we'll make it auto increment. Now, it is possible to do this and not actually have that ID field in there, because sometimes because you'll see here in a minute, it can make it a little bit more confusing. And usually in the case of relationships tables, you don't necessarily need an ID, because you're always gonna, for a relationship table, you're going to be querying the two different objects that are being related. You'll rarely ever query the actual ID of this object. However, I'm just going to leave it in kind of to give you kind of a standard. But if you kind of felt like you didn't need it or wanted to remove it, you could actually do that in this particular case. All right, so in this case, the next thing we're going to do is our next field is going to be our object ID. So this is going to be the ID of our one of our objects, which is, in this case, we're just calling objects. So the object ID is going to be, again, pretty similar. Again, 20. Again, we want this unsigned because it's not going to be negative. And we can leave the rest of this. Okay, so that's the object ID. Then we would have our tag ID. So this is the ID of our tag that we're connecting with this object. So we'll go again, big int 20, unsigned, because this cannot be, again, we don't want it to be able to be negative. And that's actually all we're going to use here. We don't really need anything else for this, because we're just essentially tying two objects together. Now, there are scenarios where you may need another field. For example, with wishlist member, we have an Autoload field that can be set to yes or no. With WordPress, they have a term order. That doesn't really apply with what we're doing here, and a lot of times in your applications it probably won't apply. So just going to leave this how it is. All right, so that's our fields. We'll go ahead and hit save there. So now we have our objects, we have our object meta, and we have our object tags. And so that gives us all of the three different fields, different types of fields that you may create when creating a database, and that's how to create them all manually. All right, so as we go throughout the course, we'll obviously dive into this more, but I want to keep this video just to how to manually create them. In the next video, we're going to talk about how to dynamically create this using PHP, so that you notice that process took a little bit, and if you need to use this application you're building over and over, or you're going to release it to other people, you really don't want them to have to go through and create all of this manually, especially if they're an end user that really may not be technical like this. You don't want them to have to do that. So we're going to talk about how to create the same database structure, but we're going to do it dynamically using PHP. All right, so that's how to create your database fields manually. Hopefully you enjoy that. I'll talk to you later.